There we go.
Cool. All right. Look, it's probably, unless anyone has any objections, we can probably accept these both together. Does that work? Yep. All right. I can't actually find the poll, so maybe we'll just do a quick show of hands. All those who accept approving both minutes for the 11th and the 16th, please click the hand gesture.
So it looked to be 14 hands up in total.
Get a couple more. $15. What's a quorum?
That's almost a majority, but not quite, because you don't count as chair. So we do need to check who opposes and who abstains.
All right. Does anyone oppose or does anyone oppose? Please raise your hand if you oppose accepting the meetings, approving the meetings. Nope. No one opposes. I think we can assume the rest are abstaining, so that's 15 for, none against.
15, yeah, 0 negative, and I think it would end up being 14 abstain at the time. Yep, sounds good.
Yep. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. All right, so we had three actions listed for this session, which I think we're all going to cover today. So Andy is going to add some patient centricity principles, as well as incorporating principles on solving existing problems. I think, Andy, we've got both of those.
No. I've been doing, I did my other two things that aren't on the action list, but I didn't get around to them. So I will do them for the next meeting. I just was having a look at the page. So mea culpa, yes, I must get into action.
No worries. All right, thanks, Andy. We'll note those as actions for the next meeting. And Kylan, you had a task to make visible CDG principles in an easy to find format, e.g. on a web page.
So it's on our Sparked website now, the new website, spark.sara.au. And if you go to the CDG page, it's just on the bottom half of that.
Brilliant. Awesome.
Could you drop a link in the chat, Kylan?
Yeah.
Awesome, thanks.
Sparked website looks really good, by the way.
Yep, and then we'll pop that link in the minutes for today.
All right, and once, is there any other business that we need to cover at this point in the meeting? Nope. Okay, great. Kylan, are you happy to start on the update on eRequesting?
Yep. Do you mind keeping the slides going?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, awesome. Thanks. So I just had a few updates that I thought I would just bring to the group, or some of them are kind of just, I guess they're just what we've been doing over the last couple of weeks. I think some of you might have attended this out of session meeting. So we had a CDG and eRequesting TDG meeting a couple of weeks ago. At that meeting, we did a quick recap of AUCDI. So we looked at what we had included, which was the sex assigned at birth, gender identity, and pronouns. We had Ruben present about 15 minutes on the agenda of the Gender Harmony project, really focusing around that sex parameter for clinical use, as that fits in the most relevant to what we're looking for. And once we did that, we did open up for discussion. So the discussion, we were kind of like, you can say anything you feel like, but we did provide these questions here kind of as things to think about, looking at, current implementations of these types of things, what requirements do people have, and then around sex parameter for clinical use itself, what are the benefits, what were the problems, if they were thinking of whether it was safe and reliable and whether or not this is feasible or not. So that discussion went on for a good bit. And once we kind of passed that, if you go to the next slide, we did do a Mentimeter just to get a feel of how people were vibing on the day. And it's quite interesting that Menti was quite, I think it was quite reflective of the discussions. It was very acknowledgement that there were issues that we need to address and that it's not something really simple, but there was a lot of, so that the work was needed, but there was a lot of mixed feelings about it in terms of confusion, complication, and things like that. So I tried to kind of have a quick view of what that might look like. So if we can go to the next slide. I tried to kind of score the answers, whether being positive or negative against, and also look at whether they were talking about whether we needed to do something now or something at a later point. The participants, there seemed to be quite mixed. Even a single participant had quite mixed feelings. Some of them were saying it's needed and confusing at the same time. Some were saying it's confusing too early. So I kind of score, a participant could have an answer scored against more than one category. And when I looked at it, definitely a high number of positive feedback. But in terms of the now versus later, there was a lot more of like, it needs to be done later, or at least that was the kind of feedback. We had about 38 participants who were actually responding. And then if you look at the next one, we also kind of asked some questions just to see what they were feeling at the time around sex parameter for clinical use, sex assigned at birth, and gender identity, and the relationship between AUCDI and eRequesting. You can see for the sex parameter clinical use, while they may have started to there was a level of understanding of what they thought it was and how it could be used. In terms of addition for AUCDI and eRequesting, it was quite split. For sex assigned at birth, there was definitely an understanding of what it meant to them, and a reasonable agreement for eRequesting DI. It wasn't like a strong, but it was definitely there. And then gender identity, again, it was people understood, and it was a bit more definitely towards the agree side. There were some dissenters. And then if you look at the next slide, please, our takeaways from that really are, for us, there's no clear way forward for SPCU in AUCDI R1 and AU eRequesting R1. There definitely was a call for national policy and education, and that we acknowledge that there's a need for clarity on sex and gender data. It's really important, and we do need to get this right. We also agree that SPCU may be a good starting point, but really more work really needs to be done to understand its clinical implications and to clear confusion. So for us, it's too early to adopt SPCU, and we've placed it on the backlog for further discussions. We really do recommend this is taken up by all the jurisdictions to agree national policy, and then we can kind of follow on behind. Next slide, please. We also had a CDG meeting, I think it was last week, where we kind of agreed on the rest of the models that will go into eRequesting. So we looked at the generic service request, and then we looked at the medical imaging specifically and the pathology test request data groups. And so we kind of agreed that service request pattern with the additions for medical imaging, and we also, and the pathology, so things like fasting and things that were specific to each of those use cases. With down the bottom there is distribution list, urgent contact, and billing guidance. That was really just to say that, yes, it's important, but we're not defining it. So we will leave that to the TDG, but we just wanted to recognize that this was really important for clinicians to have there. And then we also looked at the beginnings of an implanted medical device summary, and that would just include some initial data elements, device name, status, and a comment, and a last updated. So that's kind of what the models are looking like for now, and that's probably what will go in the eRequest draft for comment out, which is coming out soon. If you can have a look at the next slide, please. So this is what our scope looks like now. It's that service request generic with the pathology test and the medical imaging, I guess, specializations, the additional parts, the implanted device summary, and we'll incorporate elements from the problem diagnosis, adverse reaction risk, and sex and gender from AUCDI. And then we've identified these things that are in the backlog, which is the current list now. So that's where we're at. And then I think I've got one more slide. Yeah, so we are planning for that draft for community review out to go in mid-May, probably like the 15th, I think. So second, yeah, 2 weeks away, 2 to 3 weeks away. We will open it for 4 weeks. If you have any questions about timings, or you really do want to participate, but the timing's not quite working out for you guys, let us know and we can organize something. We've got an aim to publish it in October at this point. I think that's all I had, Chris.
Great, thanks, really good. Does anyone have any questions for Kylie on any of that? Nope. Okay, awesome, well done. No questions, good job.
Thank you.
All right, Andy, we might pass over to you.
Okay, are you happy for me to share my screen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, you'll have to turn off yours.
Everything working for you?
Oh yeah, I'm just trying to get the right screen. I've got so many windows open. Let's try this one. Can everyone see that? Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Oh, and here's Angus. I'm just going to start off making this a standing item just so that people do every now and again have an excuse to look at the principles. As I say, it is on my next list of things to do. A couple of other eRequesting things to do in the last couple of weeks. So we've got a few principles in there already, and we've got the starting point for the patient centricity and the FHIR and kind of HIE ecosystem starting points. If anyone has any additional commentary, please add them in as notes on the page, and we'll get around to augmenting the principle list. Any questions, raise your hand, otherwise I'll move on. Nope, good to go. All right, the other one that we have open is the features and the prioritization of those features. The number one is request groups, which is what we're going to spend, I think, most of today talking about. That's got 23 votes. I'm pretty sure the last comment on the not voted sounds like Angus.
I'm here now.
Did you make that comment?
Need to express a secret. Yeah, I did make that comment. Why is it? Yeah, I don't know why it's in the downvote. I don't know.
No, it's not. It's just in. Well,
I think, Andy, because you're not logged in, I think if you logged in, you would get to see who
yeah, true.
each comment is.
Yeah, it screws up the formatting, I think, otherwise.
Yeah. I was uploading it. That was just a comment.
Yeah. So there's a few others here with high-ish counts. I think the other one I saw was MHR upload consent. And these ones around doctor codes and barcodes is up above 10 as well. Copy to another practitioner, and keeping in my head, I think claim order for fulfillment is got pretty high count as well. If you are interested in the implementation guide, there was an update to the scaffold branch that was made, I think, yesterday, that includes the agreement we had at our previous meeting around the generic data model mapping. So those have now been put into the branch and is built on the website. And if someone, I don't know, Danielle, you could throw in the reference to that. So
Yep,
that people
just dropped it in the chat.
Excellent. Alrighty. So what we're going to probably spend, I'm not going to go through that scaffold at the moment. If we had any spare time after we do the grouping stuff, we can get to it, but I think the grouping is going to subsume all of the time we have today. So let me stop sharing that and start sharing some PowerPoint. If I can find it, PowerPoint would be in my best interest if I close down all my other windows before getting into this meeting. That one. Alrighty, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent. So one of the topics we've previously discussed is this separation of the clinical service request, which designates the test or procedure that is being requested, from something in FHIR, which is the task representing fulfillment and the status of fulfillment for that requested service. So we've gone through that before. I think everyone was, I think, okay with the existence of these two distinct workflows, the workflow of service request creation, which from a clinical perspective is in the control of the clinician who's doing the requesting, and then the workflow associated with fulfillment, which in effect is mostly controlled by the filler in that relationship. They then get to document how their fulfillment is going and when it completes. If anyone has any questions, raise your hand now. We can briefly revisit that, but I don't think that was too controversial at the time. The thing that we get pretty soon after this, though, is the concept of grouping a set of service requests together and to make them part of, and I know it's controversial to talk about requests versus orders, but to make it part of a set, which is what we typically see in the forms for pathology or for radiology that the clinician generates. And what we're attempting now to do is to say, well, how would we represent that in a digital form? And we have a bunch of building blocks that FHIR provides us. And I guess first up, if we look at the service request, there is this concept of a requisition ID in a service request. This is a composite request ID that allows you to have a common group identifier that's associated with a series or a set of requests. So you know they're related, but the only way you can discover the group is by looking at this particular attribute on a bunch of different service requests. So what we would then do is search for service requests where the requisition identifier is a particular group identifier. Go on to the next one. In a FHIR task. So we looked at the service request side, and the FHIR task, we have a similar concept that includes this attribute called group identifier. For group identifier, again, we have a common set of group identifiers that exist across a series of tasks, so we can find the related tasks by looking for tasks with the same attribute. What we also get within the task resource is this reference from the task to the request that the task is about. And in this case for us, the focus is going to be a service request. So if you recall, we've got one service request mapped to, or one task mapped to one service request, and they're linked via this focus. And there is this kind of implied grouping that is created through the shared identifier. In implementation, this turns out to be a challenge. It's a challenge to discover new groups of requests, because the only way you can do it is to match all of those shared group identifiers. So we have found it a challenge to dig up the whole group, because when we go and say, give me all of the new service requests or new tasks, we then have to go through then and look at each of the novel group identifiers or requisition IDs in those resources. So at the time we thought, it's got to be a better way of doing this. So in tasks, we can have this hierarchical relationship between tasks. So we can say that a single task, which is associated with a single service request, and if you recall from a pathology example, that would be a single test. That single task can be part of a higher order task, which is using this part of attribute, and that higher order task is what I'm going to refer to as a group task. So the group task is then representing fulfillment of a set of other tasks. And those other tasks are task service request relationships for each individual test in pathology sense that was being requested. So we do then carry this parental relationship within that task world. So hopefully this little picture makes sense to everyone. The task has a relationship to the individual service request. It also has a relationship back to this group task, which is independent of each individual task and sits by itself, but then represents the whole order in some ways. That is true. How do we distinguish those group tasks from the individual tasks? A couple of ways of doing it. You can do it using a FHIR concept called missing, which means if you look down at that task question mark, part of missing equals true. What that's saying is, if you were doing a search, it says, give me back all tasks that do not have a part of attribute. So that means it's going to give you back all of these group tasks because they're not part of anything else. Whereas for an individual task, they will actually include a part of attribute because they will be part of a group task. In FHIR, task is a task is a task. The only difference is either the profile you apply to them or the attributes with which they were created. We have found it useful to apply something called a tag to the resource to differentiate the two different types of tasks. It is an easy thing to search on. One of the challenges with missing is that in a production system, the maintenance of missing indexes for missing attributes there is an overhead to it, which, in an academic exercise, yes, you could always do it that way. But in an implementation sense, you do need to turn on within your FHIR server support for missing, which is not necessarily always turned on, and it will create an implementation overhead. I thought, Talwinder, you were going to have a question.
Yeah. First question, and is the group identifier at the task level?
Sorry.
Okay. Do we really need it at request task?
Do you really need it? In theory, you could pick up that group identifier via its parent. So if you always had it in a group task, yes, you could in theory do that. I usually think it's a good idea to keep the task resource relatively complete. I would, and not talking about service requests, but just talking about tasks, I would tend to include it. I don't know what your comment is on that, Angus, given you're on the filler side.
Yeah, it kind of makes it a bit more explicit that this task is part of the group rather than having to follow the part of to find its group. I'd also highlight a problem.
We're going to get to that problem.
Yeah, the count, the missing.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll let you get there.
Yeah. So missing, you mentioned that that surely have some issues, but we was also thinking like if we don't put group identifier in the individual task, but only in the group task, then we can search using group identifier colon missing equals to false will give us all the group tasks. So, and if you're looking for their children, that will come from the part of.
I'm personally a big fan of the tag option. That's my view. Like, because you're explicitly tagging group tasks as group tasks and child tasks as child tasks, and then that enables you in searching to say, find group tasks, find child tasks. You can say where this group identifies this. I'm not so keen on the part of missing, because it's kind of might be true today that all the tasks in your repository where missing are group tasks. That doesn't necessarily mean in the future someone doesn't create another type of task that doesn't have a part of that is not a group task. So it's a bit of it's a very loose way of finding group tasks, where a tag is very explicit. It says this is a eRequesting group task, not just a task missing a part of reference. And then I kind of like having group identifiers on all the tasks. It's kind of a shortcut. You can find the children tasks by the group identifier and without having to. I know you can do a chain. You could say child task where part of dot group identifier equals this.
One of the things we've found with experience is that it's sometimes useful to build some robustness into the system. So if you discover, for instance, a task that is within your FHIR repository, you immediately can recognize its group belonging. It's not a huge overhead, and looking at many different FHIR stack implementations, missing is an overhead that is not always turned on for that reason. The same reason you don't turn validation on in production usually. So anyway, it's something we need to come to a consensus on.
Can I ask Tailwinder, so you were suggesting to not put a group identifier on the task? And what's your reasoning? Just because it's extra information, you're just trying to single source the group identifier, or what's your reasoning for not suggesting to not put it on the child task?
Well, I don't see any purpose for making any query at that task resource using that group identifier. there's no use of filling up that information there. And
Um,
moreover, it's like until we put any tag, it's making us difficult to recognize, right, which is a group and which is not a group task.
Look, we're all going to somewhat arrive at different implementations, but certainly my implementation relies on the child tasks having group identifiers on them.
Ask why you do that, just to help us understand it.
Yeah, it's a bit long-winded. So the issue I had when I first built an implementation is, and I explained this at the Connectathon we had in, was it Melbourne? The last Connectathon we had. So I ran into the issue that I'm trying to consume lots of orders, right? And if I try and just sort of get 2 orders all in one query, there's potential that one of those orders has an error, a data error. You know, I'm validating. I'm getting my data and I'm checking it's sound before I commit it, right? And so potentially one of those orders could have some sort of data issue, which I want to reject, to say, hey, this is not as it should be. To do that, I really need, it's easier, there's less cognitive load if each process of getting an order is an atomic transaction, right? Rather than me saying, hey, give me the orders, and it goes, yeah, here's 200 orders, and I start working through 200 orders, and the 156th order has an exception in it, and now I need to like end and error back, and it's sort of like, shit, but I've got 150 that are okay, I've got another 150 that I haven't even processed yet, and this one in the middle that's an error. So to make that whole problem simpler, what I do is I say, give me all group tasks. So now the first query I make against the server says, give me all group tasks that are pending orders, right? And I just get a list of, say, 100 group tasks. They're very simple because they're just one group task, and each task represents one whole request, right? And then I sort of put that in a queue. And then I grab the first group task off the queue, and now I'm doing one atomic transaction that says, give me the child tasks and all the order information for this group task, this one order. And so if that fails, if I validate that and it's like, oh, there's an error with this order, I can just reject that order, job done, move on to the next one. And it makes it simpler. And then because I do that, what I actually do is when I pull that group task off my queue, the first query I do is I say, give me the child tasks that have this group task group identifier on it. And so that's, you know, I'm sure there's other ways I could do that, but that's what I'm doing today. So I do rely on the child task having the group identifier on it, and that group identifier matches the parent's group identifier, because that's how I search for them. I have the group task in my hand, I look at its group identifier, and I make a query saying, give me all child tasks that have this group identifier, and the 5 tasks come back. I'm sure there's other ways to cut that, but that's my use case and what I do.
The other thing, and this is it is, I think, part of a broader discussion and decision around the relationship between the parent and the child and what data sits in which. Because I think I personally would say, if you're going to make a call, if we make a call on only having the group identifier in the parent, I think we would also likely only put the, for instance, the owner, the assignment in the parent. And in fact, anything, you know, you would then make the child tasks actually subservient and incomplete without the parent. One of the challenges with this, obviously, is where we've come from as we started in the last little while, assuming that we were doing everything at that request granularity. So it was always a relationship task to service request. So at that stage, we needed the group identifier in there. But now we're kind of going, if we introduce a parent, can we now take out a bunch of data that might be in that that child task? Because, you know, what we're allowing for in the future, I think, is fulfillment statuses and status information on a test-by-test basis, but we might have other information which is actually shared across a set of tests or a set of requests. And that then is an argument to say maybe that should only live in the parent, and therefore it's more consistent. You would never then get them out of sync because they would be dependent on their child-parent relationship. So I don't know, Telwinder, if you've thought about owner in the same sense.
Yes, because we don't see any use case in a practicality, right? The order has been raised for 3 requests, 2 for one owner and 1 for other one, and that's never going to be a use case, right? So all the tests will go to one owner, and group having linkage to the owner make more sense.
I
Okay.
agree with that, and even my comment about I use the group identifier on the child task. Now I can sit here and I can think of other ways to do it. Like I could get my child task by part of references the group that I have in my hand. So there are other ways around it. I'm just
The only case is when if you are thinking that there will be child tasks to the group can have different contexts out of this, which I don't see. Uh, then which that will come, but part of our will is one linkage, and if we are establishing one more linkage using group identifiers, so then some implementers using group identifiers to fetch it, some using part of to fetch it, will varies the things.
So is your recommendation to extract both the owner and the group out of the child?
Yeah.
and single source it on the parent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anyone think that's a bad idea? Just raise your hand. Hopefully I can see them. Apart from Angus.
I'm just nervous to make the decision now. It hasn't filtered down yet.
And this,
No, I'm not asking for a decision. I just want to get a feel for, whether anyone has any issues.
But yeah, for me, like I actually have an implementation of this sort of running. For me, the group identifier on the task I actually use, so it's going to be painful to change. The owner on the child task I don't use. Like the owner, I search for the owner of the group task. But
I'd like to see the two solutions side by side because I can't picture it in my head.
I can stick it in there. I can stick Telwinder's approach into the scaffold if you want to have a look at it.
That'd be great.
I'd make a comment too, and I don't want to revert back to the past, and I don't even know why, but in V2 messaging, we definitely duplicate the group identifier on each OBR, right? So we have an OBR for each test. It's all in one message, and each OBR restates the group identifier over and over and over. I don't have a good reason as to why, but I'm just saying that happened in the past.
Well, I mean, it's just sort of, some of this is phrasing here, because nothing that we decide would, I think, even prevent that, right? Like we're not talking about prohibiting that inclusion. I think about it as
I would actually
prohibit.
mean in the child. Well, I think we've got to decide, because part of this is, do we allow these task service request relationships to live without a parent? So are we going to coexist a single test by itself? If there is only one test, do we enforce that you have an artificial, in some ways, parent to that? And obviously we've chosen to do that because of consistency. So we've said that the parent is actually the whole order, and therefore if there's only one test in the order, it's still a whole order. So we have both. Now you could say that's an overhead. It is, but otherwise when you're implementing this, having to support both the option of single service request, single task versus the parent and child relationship. It's a pain in the rear end, to be honest, to do that, to do both of them.
So just to confirm then, if there is a single order, right? So there is just one. In that case, does that mean we're having two where there's both the grouper and the child, or are we saying that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's
Yes.
always like a minimum of two because we're always having a grouper and it at minimum refers to one child, basically.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So it'd be a consistent rule, and in this case, you know, we would still extract that. So we would restrict the owner and the group identifier from not. So it can't be in a child task, and it must be in the group task.
You basically make it impossible to process something just based on the child. You have to get its parent because you're missing information unless you get its parent.
Yeah.
It's one or the other either
I
way.
agree with
Because
that.
if you support a single task to service request relationship, then you support two single tasks to service request relationship.
It just gets complicated.
That is, you know, that's the same as a group task, but without a group task. So that's essentially supporting the other thing. So I think you either have to enforce it or just remove the group task.
Yeah, I agree. It's one or the other. I'm for the group task, but I don't agree with the hybrid. You know, sometimes you have a group and sometimes you don't. I think that gets really confusing.
Does this also fly for imaging?
Yes.
Does it fly for future case? Probably not.
I have an alternative implementation. It's not a FHIR implementation, but we do at Aurabox run a massive task processing system that moves all sorts of imaging data around, and it uses a group task-like structure. So every time we want to create a thing, we create a group task, and then we spawn child tasks that actually do the work off that. And that was a implementation that we came to after trying the other model, and it becoming essentially unworkable. So I think
Excellent. We're all in agreement.
Architecturally, that model actually is much easier to manage despite its apparent complexity.
Yeah, I feel we probably agree on the group, having a group. The next question is, does information, you know, like the group identifier, does it need to be on all the children, or is it not going to be on the children because it'll only be on the group because there's no need for it to be on the children? You know, do you duplicate data on children just for data's sake to maybe simplify some search or something? I'm not sure.
Be on the child and not the group.
Sorry, I missed that, Chris.
It should be on the child and not the group. So the task references the group and should identify the group. The group shouldn't have to reference the task. Otherwise, you have to update the group if you add a task to it.
Let's get to that one in a
We'll
moment.
get to that one.
The other thing I wanted just to say on this is that obviously, given this is just a normal old task, group task is a task, then it too has a focus. But in this instance, we have nothing to focus the group on. So it's not about fulfilling something at the moment. So I guess that brings us to the next bit of the conversation, which is what do we focus the group fulfillment on, given it needs something. We can leave it out, but it kind of, when I showed this to Graham in early days, he went, it's all very interesting, but it's not balanced. Like you've missed the focus of the task, the group fulfillment task, and that was is part of something else we've started to look at. The other thing I want you to note is, I guess what Chris just said, which is, I'll get you to just a second, Talwinder, that the relationship here is from task to group. And that means the group has no explicit understanding on its children. The plus side of that is that you can dynamically add a child and you know, they're part of the group. The downside to it is if you see the group, you really don't know how many children there are. And the only way to discover the children is to do a search and find everything that references you, everything that references that group. And I guess from implementation experience, the checks and balances, this is a challenge in some prior implementations of having that disconnect. We don't have that in our standard requesting world, that we explicitly have an order and it knows the components of the order. This is basically allowing for an order which can dynamically grow and expand, which is not the foundation of policy settings, regulatory settings, financial settings around the way we do diagnostic requesting in Australia. Just noting also that one of the reasons why you see that the group concept is actually an embedded feature of a service request and a task is that in the US, the concept of a group of tests being ordered is not having the same business model associated with it. So there's never been a drive to create the order as a whole first class data element on its own. It's only represented through the shared feature of that group identifier, which doesn't work for us. Telwinder.
Thanks, Andy, for all that explanation. Before going to the next level, I would we'd like to talk on the tag as well, because I echo with your point on performance with missing, and that surely will happen when if the filler is keep on polling and there's a bunch of orders been coming up. If we are doing based on some QR code or some number, then it's always a one order. There's not much impact. But if we think of using a tag, or we still want to have that, and we want to create a profile over group task, which will be having group identifier as a mandatory field and the tag saying that it is a group task, that would be a big clarity on group tasks and making it differentiation. Are we thinking of doing it?
I mean, I too like the concept of the group tag, just to be explicit, and it does make the discovery of new orders via the group task very explicit.
I like it as well. I like having the tag, it being explicit. The only other one I would throw out there for the cat amongst pigeons is task.code, which is just another option of tag or task.code. Task.code typically says fulfillment, like there's an example value set on it, and that example value set has things like approved, fulfilled, aborted, replaced, changed, suspended, resumed. But it's an example table set, and you could put many. So we typically put fulfill there, right? We're saying this is a task for you to fulfill, but you could put a second code in there and say fulfill group task. That said, I think I still lean towards tag.
What will be in the request task then? What will be the code for the request task?
Exactly, you'd need another one. So I think my view is, while we're talking about tag, you would have a group tag and you would have a child tag. Maybe better words than those, but and then it's like, do you use tag or use task.code? So a task.code of group and a task.code of child. Yeah. I think I lean towards the tag, but I think if we're going to use tag on group, I think it makes sense to use tag on child as well.
The other thing to keep in mind is this will not be the only use of task within eRequesting. There will be other uses of task, because in general, a task is simply a way of tracking fulfillment. And so that's of any request. And we will have needs for other requests, particularly communication requests. Danielle.
Just checking, when we're talking about tag, is that inside Meta? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's just another bit of, it's a bit of metadata. The other way you can distinguish these things in theory is via profile. You can see what profile is being applied, but that's very clunky and not very useful way of doing it. Alrighty, forge ahead. So this is how you go about searching one of the issues that Angus and I both found is this issue of, did you get all the children? And assuming the server is 100% reliable, you should always get the children. But what if you didn't? How would you ever know? And this is one of the, I guess, things with FHIR is this reverse reference mechanism. There is no built-in check and balance in that system. You require the correctness of discovering all of those children. And there is at least one FHIR server that Angus and I both know that has some challenges with the timeliness of index updating that can lead to abnormal behavior in the data, the synchronization between searching and the database. But in that sense, you never know whether you got the children or not. So come back to that.
I think for Andy and I, this has been probably one of the biggest learnings about implementation is, while Chris, I agree with your view, and that's what we did, it really bit us in the butt because we got in a situation where we asked the server for the child, search for the child tasks, and it gave me 3, and I go, oh, there's 3 tests, but there wasn't, there was 6, and there was no way for me to data validate how many tests were there. The server said there was 3, so there was 3, but if there was 6, I'm just unaware, and that's because of this, the way it's arranged. So it means as a receiver trying to find your order, you're very reliant, as Andy said, on the indexing of the system. That FHIR server was taking transactions of orders, notifying us that, hey, there's an order here for you. But when I came to get that order and said, hey, give me all the child tasks, it goes, oh, here's 3. And it was still doing the transaction, and the other 5 were not available yet. But I didn't know because I just got 3. So it caused quite an issue.
So there needs to be some way to validate the group task, essentially.
Well, and this is one of the things I think we need to think about, these group tasks and these grouping structures. They do represent, in effect, a first-class order. They are a structure that is very important in the way Australia processes diagnostic requests, which is, again, as I say, is not foundational in FHIR and the way that others look at requesting in FHIR, because it's always on a one-by-one kind of basis.
American billing is not like ours. So America, it's you order one test, you order another test, you order another test, you order another test, and it's all billed one, $20 for that test, $10 for this test, $15 for that test. But in Australia, it's all about a service of, it's on a service date, but effectively becomes a group. So billing is very group related. Yeah.
And Chris, Diane, that's exactly what I guess we're looking at, is to say, should we introduce a quantity into the group task so you'll know how many children you should expect. Now, of course, that breaks the ability to dynamically add new children without needing to modify the group task. But I guess the argument I'd make around that is that for us, if you did end up trying to add a new child, you would have to update the group as well. But I think that comes to the nature of that group representing something that has a real existence, which is the whole order itself. So when I talked about what is the focus of the group task, one of the things then is to say, well, how do we group the requests together? And that group of requests is kind of the mirror image of the task group. If you recall that the way requests are managed and created is by the placer, by the clinician. The filler doesn't get to modify them. It's up to the clinician to set them in play, to monitor, to have a workflow of their creation and completion and cancellation, all that, independent of fulfillment. So in terms of the representation of this concept, there's basically 3 approaches, and I've switched between all 3 over the last few months. So what could you use for this? There is something that I think has been noted somewhere in the commentary, that is one of the things we miss with the reverse link from a child task to a parent task is actually order or sequencing. So when you go and search for child tasks that have a link to a parent, it'll give them back to you in a random order. So you can't explicitly know what sequence those tests were created, and more importantly, written potentially on a paper form. And so then at a FHIR, you will potentially have a paper form version which has the tests in a certain order, but what you'll see from a digital representation is a completely different order, and that creates huge issues in the FHIR. So how do we keep track of that order, that sequencing? It's problematic. One way of doing it is if we decide to represent a group of requests as an explicit list. So it's a service group becomes a profile of a list, and most important bit it contains is an ordered or sequenced list of entries which reference service requests. Easy as, lightweight, wonderful. There are some downsides to doing that, in that natively you carry no other information about the group of service requests. For instance, anything common, as Talwinder talked about with a task, would not be there. There is another option. If you consider the list being more your toy hammer or very lightweight hammer, this is the request group is your all singing, all dancing sledgehammer. The request group is something that was defined in R4. A request group is a resource that in particular is about the orchestration of a set of requests in fulfillment of, seeking fulfillment of a plan definition. So it really gives you very fine control over how a sequence of activities should be sequenced. So it can say things like, do this one, or do one from this group, followed by something from this other group. Or if this one finishes successfully, go and do this one. If you really cut it back, you can pretend that it's only going to have, in effect, the sequencing information of a set of service requests. But that was not what it was designed for. And unfortunately, one of the implications of using request group is that it subsumes all of the status that the individual service requests have. So you have to move those service requests to be in a category of option. So it's an option. That service request is an option of a request group. The reason it's called option is because it may not occur according to the request group, because the request group is not just about doing everything, it's about doing a particular sequencing of it, making decisions along the way, what comes next. That's what I originally started using, and I don't know, Talwinder, whether you went down that path, but I think it's problematic because of its constraint that it applies to the children. The positive thing is that you do get the sequencing out of it.
To describe request group another way, it's a great name. Like request group sounds like exactly what we want. but it's really about not the instance of a request, but it's about the instantiation of requests. It's like a plan. It's like someone says, in this scenario, you would do this group of service requests. That's what request group's about. It's not really about an instance of an actual order to be actioned. It's like a shopping list that says, in this plan definition, like if a patient has bowel cancer and these conditions, then we would suggest this group of requests be done. That's what its use case is. It's not really about grouping the actual instance of those orders being done.
Yeah, and that's
wanted
why
to
it's
call
called
out-
request orchestration in R5. Sorry, Daniel.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I was just going to say that it would be a backwards compatibility issue, a forwards compatibility issue, I guess, into R5 using request group for some of the reasons we've kind of called out there.
Yeah. It's deceiving. It's very deceivingly looks like what we want, but it isn't.
So, and that brings us to a more recent conversation, which is to say, well, given we reuse tasks to get the task group, why aren't we reusing service requests to get a service request group? And the beauty of using service request is it carries obviously all of the attributes that the children potentially have, and has a similar concept of part of through a based on relationship. So we could then carry a service request group and let it then become, in effect, our placer version of the task group, in that it represents the whole of the set of things that you want to happen. So it's better in that way. The downside to it is you don't get the list. So it has the same relationship that the task group has. So it's a reverse link from the child to the parent. It
leaves us still with the problem of how do you define the order that things were ordered in, and now this group of service requests doesn't solve that problem. You're now still looking for a solution to the order problem, which is now maybe extensions on service requests to say 1, 2, 3, 4, or we haven't solved that problem even though we've created a grouper.
That would be something like sequence, yeah.
Mm.
And the problem, of course,
add them to a list. Can you add them to a list as well, just as a separate data structure?
You could. So you could add an extension to service request group that had an explicit list of the children, but now you've got the child to the parent and the parent to the child. Kind of
the issue with that, of course, is that if you're putting the information about sequencing and you're not carrying it on the child itself, that means, again, it's not on the child itself. It's only in that parent thing that you're trying to rely to process on that. And I'm not sure if it will also cause challenges.
Well, but I think one of the things that this makes very clear is that for us, the whole order is something which is a first-class data issue for us. Like, it's not for international, the US, but it is for us. And like Talwinder was arguing with the data attributes that we should push up to the parent in a task, there's a more complicated and bigger question about all of that here as well. That we are potentially going to make assumptions that a bunch of those service requests are just going to share the same value. So, for instance, are we going to allow for some children to be high priority, some children to be low priority, or is priority something which is on the whole order? There's a bunch of other attributes.
Clinical notes, like, so they might say HIV positive patient. Do we need to say that on the full blood count, the liver? Like, if they are, the whole group is. It's not like the full blood count is HIV positive, but the liver function isn't. So you could start moving things up into the group service request, which are group level concepts. of which there's many of.
And there could be something that is specific to a single service request, but that's getting into some pretty sophisticated ordering kind of user interface.
It doesn't
issues.
rule it out. We can still have a granular level test specific property if that's what it calls for. But we don't now no longer need to if it's a generic across all tests type of property.
So that's one of the positives, I guess, of using this service request approach is it allows us that flexibility that we could replicate the kind of the task kind of appropriate positioning of the data and not duplicate unless you really want the option of having separate. We are going to then have to lead to, what happens when you have a copy in both. So a child has the attribute and the parent, and they're different. What do we want to do about it? There would absolutely be cases where that's completely appropriate to do. But the first issue is really, I think sequencing is actually a requirement, and there's only really two ways of doing it. We either stick a number in the children to have that order. There are issues then about, well, not necessarily issues, but are they a relative order? So you can have 2 2s, 1 2 2 3 in the children. Make them all 2s. Is that okay? So we could do that in the child, or we could build the explicit list into the parent, and then we would have at least that explicit quantity somewhere to give us, because of all of these are reverse references, right? So it is create some potential fragility in some implementations. So kind of having that list lets us kill 2 birds with 1 stone in some ways.
I kind of feel like the big decision here is you're either going one way or the other, right? You're either accepting that the world is a grouping world and therefore completely model that world, except that there is always a group and there is a place to put group properties and go with that. Otherwise, you're going the other way, which is saying, oh no, everything must be independent and the group is just sort of like this virtual concept. To me, there's a fork in the road here. It can't be both. Like to be both, we end up with a pretty terrible solution on both sides. We either pick one way or the other, and then I'm leaning because of our Australian, the way we do things in Australia, especially in pathology and radiology, that we group everything. It feels like we should be going with the flow of that's how we do it in Australia. Everything is a group, therefore have a proper first-class group construct. If we don't, we're always struggling because Australia's trying to do groups and America's not doing groups, and we're trying to do both at the same time, or straddling two.
Danielle?
Yeah, I agree. I'm quite happy. I think we should just go with groups for the reasons we've talked about, unless it turns out not to work. Basically, I think that's what we should be trying to proceed down the pathway of. And yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, well, are you more convinced by a list, request group, or service request?
I don't want to go down the request group path. And the options are between list and service request. I'd rather see us, try to tackle the things that we need to deal with and what we need to get out of grouping, see how well they can match across both of them, and actually try and give them a go, possibly both of them, and put both maybe in a scaffold and see what people work with. I think we do have to design out, unless we can say now that one is obviously going to work and not the other. I think we have to go a little bit further down the path with maybe list and service request.
The problem I found with going down the list approach is that it ends up with a huge number of extensions to obviously the list, and that I think there's a really strong argument that there is a lot of stuff which is order wide in terms of the information that's needed, and that you get out of the box with using the standard service request resource. And anything that you want to restrict out, you could do an absolutely this shouldn't be in the group, and absolutely this shouldn't be in a child. You know, you can kind of make those calls, and it's cutting down rather than augmenting in some ways. The big question for me is, we sequencing is an issue. It's a real clinical issue, and so we need an answer. We need a way of doing that sequencing, and so it comes free with the list, but with service request, we would need another option.
I've got to admit, that's the only reason I was thinking of list is about sequencing. The alternative is we agree on an Australian extension, we build and implement that, and we know how it works. But yeah, that's the only reason I was even considering list is that one for the moment.
The nice thing about the service request, if for instance, let's say we created an extension to service requests that included a list of based on children, then it would still work even if you didn't know how to support it. It's only really having one explicit value, which is unobtainable anywhere else, and that is if there is an explicit list that you want to maintain of those tests. And I think I have looked at the standard extension repository. I don't think I've seen that. And
No, I've looked and nothing appears obviously suitable at the moment.
I like an integer on the child, because from an implementation point of view, if someone wants to send me one where the integer is 22234, well, that's their problem, right? They know how I'm going to display it. I'm going to display it as those 222s are going to be in any order you like, but it's going to be 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 4, right? So it's really clear if the ordering thing is an integer, and sure, it opens up the door that someone could put the same integer on children, but that's their mistake to make, and it's not going to break my system, because I'm just going to order by this integer, and my system's just going to go 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, right? And if they go, these 2, 2, 2s are in the wrong order, I go, well, it's not my fault. You sent them to me as 2, 2, 2. So, and to me, that seems like a simple, you know, if somewhere on the child service request you just had an integer that was called sequence order, I can't see how it goes wrong unless the placer has a flat out error.
Tawina?
Yeah, pardon my little knowledge on actual pathology works, but I feel this list resource has nothing to do with the placer, with what we are trying to handle. If what we see as a sequencing issue is a filler issue or pillar side issue, but when placer is sending that order, while making it this resource become an overhead to them, just because we want to have some solutions to be maintained properly. But Angus, I also agree with the integer increment, because service request dot identify task style task dot identify are the fields still available to us, and we still need to identify some information about each request, like that some identifier that belongs to the service request level, so we can have incremental things there, just to know, say this is the first service request, this is the second, if that really matters. From the placer side, I don't know, like when the patient go with the request form to pathology center, at the collection center, do they really go one by one on the sequence, but based on written on the form, or they can see the urgency of the thing, which one is urgent, and they do that first. So
Yeah.
that's
So this was literally brought up by Sonic collection staff because we didn't have an order. So and it really is it's a concern of both placer and filler. And it's equal concern to both, in my view. So the placer system places 10 orders, and they print a form and they list those 10 orders in a order on the printed form, right? The patient takes that form to a collection center, they scan the barcode, and the electronic screen comes up with those same 10 orders, but in a completely different order sequence. So now the poor collection nurse, she's trying to do her job properly, and she's trying to check that that paper form equals this order, right? And she's in with her eye, she's going down the list of tests, and she's like, oh my God, this is like liver function. She has to find it in the 10 on screen. And that's just cognitive load of her task to validate that these things align. So that's the purpose. And I think that's something the placer wants. The placer wants the order to be correct and wants the whole chain of workflow to be able to function in a safe manner. And it's a concern of the lab for the exact same reasons. So I think it's a bit dismissive to say it's not a concern of the placer. The placer is the one who printed the form in a particular order. So they defined the order. The lab's just trying to replicate that order. And if you don't give us the sequence information, we can't. As for identifier as a sequencer, I can see a way that works. I'm not, and I'm sort
That's
of with
nasty.
I'm with Danielle shaking my
No,
head. Is identifiers aren't
misuse.
sequence? Yeah, it's misuse. They're not sequence. It's not the purpose of an identifier. Identifiers should be opaque, like a GUID. It shouldn't have a meaning.
Right. I'm aware that we're going to run out of time, and we're still discussing this one. What is a logical next action that we can take here?
Well, my proposal is I think that we've agreed that a task group is okay. Does anyone have an issue of not having a task group? Does anyone think that's a good idea? Put up your hand.
Are you suggesting both task group and the request group? Is that what
I
we're
am
talking about?
going to get to that one next. Yes, I just wanted to get the. Is everyone okay with task group? Because there's not a lot of choice in that one. If you do it, So I'll progress the task group into the scaffold. Those three options we have: list, request group, and reuse service request. I think I didn't hear anything positive for request group. So then it's list versus service request.
I'm happy to withdraw my tentative support for list as long as we have a sequence thing that we work through that we're comfortable with on using service request.
Yeah.
We need sequence and count though. So that problem of knowing how many are in the order, not just the sequence.
Yep.
This doesn't solve that problem anyway. So it sounds like service request is really the way to go, and then we need to work out how to fix that.
Yeah, and there's options with service requests, like the service request group. You could use quantity, because quantity on the group has no meaning, but could mean how many children there are. But that's for another day. But yeah, I think you can solve the problem there. Otherwise, you could do an extension on list. I am too bit with Danielle. I think service request and task group rather than list and task group, because we could start with list, but I think we're pretty quickly going to hop, skip, and a jump to like, we can't do anything with list but list. There's no other option but to just list stuff. And as soon as you go, hang, we need this thing at a group level, it's like, we're over to service request.
So as long as everyone is good, then that just gives me a way forward to add those two kind of building blocks in, because to be honest, it makes life more difficult to move the other stuff forward without those two bits in play. The bit around the sequence order in the child and maybe a count in the parent, I'll maybe come up with an example of potentially doing it. But I think that the important one for me is, is everyone okay with me putting the two groups in and see where we go from that?
Do I need to move a motion?
Yes, move a motion, Angus.
I move a motion that we have a service request group and a task group.
I second.
Come on, Chris.
Right. Yep.
You got to
let's
do
take
your.
take a vote on that, shall we? Everyone who agrees, please raise your hand.
Find my hand first. Here it is.
I see 29 participants.
Those that are still awake.
We have 17 for. Thank you. You may put down your hands. Anyone voting against, please raise your hand. All others are assumed to be abstaining.
Which is 11
Yep,
people.
that's 11 abstaining. Okay, brilliant.
Can I just make one final note, Chris, which is there was some confusion, I think, not confusion, but there's another issue here at play, which is the grouping of tests that are actually subsumed within a test code. Yes, that is a version of the grouping concept, and that's not explicitly dealt with in any of this stuff. The other thing that we need to talk about, which is probably another conversation, is about barcodes, tokens, and their relationship to group identifiers and how those interlink. And that's another one of the features that is within our list of interesting features to talk about. So we will, that's all I wanted to raise in this thing today. I will take an action to put up some changes into the scaffold, and maybe in a subsequent meeting we can then run through that scaffold and look at how the new features reflect some of these discussions, and you can throw stones at it.
Great. That's really good. Thank you, Andy. That was great. Great discussion today. Awesome. So one last thing before we go, and we'll have you out of here on time. We're just going to review the meeting coming up for May. So right now we have meeting schedules for the 9th, the 14th, 23rd and 28th. They are all 90-minute meetings at 11 a.m. The question that was raised was whether this cadence is too difficult for people and whether or not people require something else. And there is a secondary question, which is whether the May 28th meeting needs to be cancelled due to an MS-IA meeting clash. So, not sure how anyone wants to handle this, but perhaps we could just take a vote on the meetings. That might be the easiest way to do it. I think if you are not happy with this meeting cadence and wish to review it, could you please raise your hand? Nope. Okay. We have one. It's Andy.
The only reason I raise this is that when we go from a Thursday to a Tuesday, it's really hard to get things done, so move things ahead. It's really only a couple of days of time to put in, and I think some of the things we talk about actually require a fair bit of kind of investment. If we continue the cadence, then it just means we're going to have to be doing things in parallel and running them on overlapped kind of schedules. Things we agree here actually don't kind of manifest till post the next meeting kind of thing.
Yep, that's completely fair enough. Does anyone else have anything they want to say on that? Are there any other suggestions for how we might resolve that issue?
I think the reason that it is Tuesday is because this time slot on Thursday is the core. Is that right, Danielle? Yeah.
Yes.
So So if it was the same day each week, we might change the time slot so it doesn't conflict with our core.
And I think, I don't know if it'll turn out to be an issue yet. I mean, it hasn't, and we can always talk about like, what are we going to show through another meeting? So far, we're not, I know we talk about the scaffold, but we haven't directly reviewed the scaffold in some of these. And I think for some of our meetings, we might end up trading off between discussing exactly what's in the scaffold and that work, and maybe on some of the other topics that we might end up coming through. And we can also decide to cancel a following meeting if we don't think it's, useful. So I guess just for everyone who's on the line here, will we hold our next meeting, which is next Thursday, so the 9th of May, and we can just recheck again on the 9th of May if we want to do the 14th meeting?
Why don't we, now that we've given people the opportunity to think about this, why don't we review that entire question of meeting cadence on the Thursday? We could do something like we could set aside Thursdays for just general discussion and reviewing IG components or whatever, while if there's an actual task to be done, we push it out to the following.
That might work well. I know AU Core trades off its meeting topics, has conformance Fridays, and then other business on the Thursday meetings for when it does different things.
Yep.
All right.
I'm just wondering if the issue might be that we're tending to say next meeting we'll do this thing rather than being realistic about how long it might take to do those things. Yep. All right. Okay. If everyone's happy, we will cover this again at the next meeting briefly. Is that acceptable, Andy? Great. Awesome. All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Next meeting is on the 9th of May. Does anyone wish to cancel the 28th of May meeting based on the MSIA meeting? Does anyone have a conflict there that's an issue for them? Could you please raise your hand so we might have some indication? Nope. Okay, looks like that meeting's probably fine then.
But this meeting's more important.
Yep, absolutely. All right, okay, I think we're all done. Any other business anyone needs to raise really quickly in the last -3 minutes? No? All right, thanks everyone. All done for today. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.